The death penalty. Interesting take on this. Capital punishment is on its last breath in the U.S. Interestingly enough, it's the GOP that may deliver the final blow. So says our next guest, Patrick Huff, writing in the Hill, the Young Voices contributor. About this, Patrick is a conservative author, contributor at Lone Conservative Young Voices. He's tweeting at Patrick Huff and is joining us here on POTUS. Patrick, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show.
So the idea, I guess, the conservative point of view is that, you know what, the government should not be controlling our lives.
Yeah, I mean, typically the Republican Party is thought of as supporting the death penalty, but as we've seen recently, they're starting to turn against it. In 2019, Republican lawmakers have introduced bills to repeal the death penalty in 6 different states. That's just this year alone. And it's also been a trend over the past decade. We've seen an increasing amount of Republican lawmakers introduce more repeals for the death penalty in their states, despite 77% of Republican voters supporting the death penalty.
Now, as you point out in your piece, there are questions, obviously, about the philosophy and whether or not, people believe in a hypothetical. You can have this sort of theoretical discussion, but there's also issues. It costs a lot of money, millions of dollars every year. A lot of innocent Americans are sentenced to death. And as you write, to top it off, 3% of executions are botched in an excruciating process that violates the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. So is this a more practical or is it a more philosophical or theoretical argument for conservatives?
I think it's both, and it depends who you're talking to, who you really want to convince to win over their view of the death penalty. So, if I'm talking to an older member of the Republican Party, I'm going to try to appeal to their skeptical government nature. I'm going to tell them about how, like you said, 3% of executions are botched and 7% of lethal injections are botched, which is a very popular method of capital punishment in today's world. And when we currently know of 160 individuals in the U.S. since 1970 who were sentenced to death but later exonerated, that's just something you can't ignore. And if you really start using these stats against people who support the death penalty, you're going to see a real shift like we're seeing right now with Republican lawmakers.
Patrick, one of the things you've also written in here is that the way that conservatives look at this, Republican lawmakers have already begun the process. For the future of America, let's hope that opponents of the death penalty win the GOP's internal battle so our country can better respect the value of a human life. Now, we've often heard the value of human life noted when it comes to discussion about abortion, for example, and this is the other end of the spectrum. And a lot of times conservatives, Republicans have been criticized for not saying, well, what's unimportant about a human life at that end of the spectrum? Why has it taken the party to this point, or why is it taking so long to come to that point of view?
Well, I think there is a big difference with abortion and capital punishment that a lot of Republicans talk about, even myself, that I can openly admit. I mean, I'm against both as a Republican, but holding this consistent life ethic does take a real consistent argument across the board. And with Republicans, a lot of their opposition to abortion and even support for the death penalty has been because of their religious beliefs. I'm Catholic, but as we've seen, even with in religion, there's been a shift against the death penalty. The Catholic Church last summer, Pope Francis changed the catechism language to completely oppose the death penalty in the Catholic Church. And in 2015, the National Association of Evangelicals changed its position of support to the death penalty to a more neutral view. So we're seeing a shift against the death penalty, not just in the Republican Party, but in society as a whole in America.
Patrick Huff with us, a conservative author, a contributor at Lone Conservative and Young Voices. His recent piece on capital punishment, something we're discussing here. In the context of last year, you note the Republican-led Senate passed criminal justice reform via the First Step Act, the shift away from the party's long-held tough-on-crime mentality. So is the party no longer tough on crime?
No, it's not to say they're not tough on crime. I mean, tough on crime is really just a saying, a talking point. Being for the First Step Act doesn't mean you're not tough on crime. It means you're for enforcing a criminal justice system that welcomes felons back into society after they've served their due time. And for the death penalty, it's about understanding justice, about understanding about those innocent individuals who were put on trial for the death penalty. So this is about justice more than anything. And what we're seeing is a bipartisan support for this criminal justice reform and a bipartisan support for this opposition to the death penalty. And that's a bipartisan support that the media hasn't necessarily given much coverage to on a national level, which in some ways makes sense considering that's a state issue. But the thing is, bipartisanship doesn't sell very well. A lot of the time, the media wants to hit controversial subjects. But right now, with criminal justice reform, we're seeing bipartisanship like never before.
You're not trying to inject nuance into political discussion, are you? Because there's no place for that in our society. I just want you to know that. I wanted to ask you about Asa Hutchinson. He's the governor of Arkansas, and he has presided over executions and has said this is the will of the people. It is the will of the state. And this is not to single him out, but he is most recent in my mind as somebody who has had to deal with this issue of bad cocktails, if you will, being delivered to some of these death row inmates. And I wonder, is it up to the state legislatures? Is it up to the federal government to legislate this? If you talk about conservatives especially, they don't like the federal government saying things. Should the states move in that direction?
Yes, and that's where the shift has been. The states are really where we're seeing all the repeals of the death penalty. There's been a lot of bills supporting repeals of the death penalty. Not all passed across the nation. Some have passed, but been vetoed by governors. It depends the state we're talking about. But another aspect is the courts. Like last year in Washington State, they ruled the death penalty unconstitutional because of its citing racial bias. So the two main places you're going to see in opposition to the death penalty that will really create a shift will be at the state legislators and at the court system.
Who's leading the fight, do you think, among politicians?
I think typically it was the Democrats, but we're seeing Republicans join them, and I think we're seeing bipartisan reform, which is phenomenal.
I mean, specifically, if there are any particular Republicans who are, you think, really making this point very well.
Sure. I mean, at the national level, we haven't seen much. As I said, it's more of a state issue. But if you're talking about Republicans focusing on criminal justice reform, the libertarian-leaning Republicans, such as Rand Paul, would be the first to come to mind, and who were very supportive of the First Step Act in December.
So we will look forward to seeing more of those developments on the state as well as the federal level. Patrick, thanks for joining us on POTUS today.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Patrick Huff is a conservative author.